Hi, Daniel.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
Doing pretty well today, thanks. Yourself?
Not too bad. Can't complain. You're in Florida, right?
Yeah, right here in Tampa.
Right here in Tampa, where the Republicans recently were.
We tried to avoid downtown when they were here just because the security was so overwhelming.
I would imagine, yes. So you didn't get to meet any of them, huh?
No.
It's too bad. They're nice people. Okay, so let me tell people a little about you. Maybe you can tell them more. You are an associate professor of anthropology at the University of South Florida. And you write a blog called Neuroanthropology. You co-founded the blog, I guess, and co-write the blog. And we're going to talk about so-called internet addiction more broadly, the habits. And the way this started is that I wrote something on the Atlantic critiquing a paper on internet addiction, and then I did a follow-up post, and then you critiqued my follow-up post, and that's how you came to my attention. You were kind of fairly savage, I guess, but that's okay. That's okay. So we're going to flesh out our differences. But first, let me ask you. Also, you've got an edited volume, right? The Uncultured Brain, and I guess the title of that has something to do with what you mean by the term neuroanthropology, right? I mean, is that kind of your term, neuroanthropology?
You know, it wasn't necessarily the term that the co-founder of the Neuroanthropology blog, we didn't invent it ourselves. It's been knocking around a little bit for a couple of decades. But we definitely took it as the name for trying to build a new field where we're integrating neuroscience and anthropology, particularly drawing on ideas of neuroplasticity, which have really come to play a major role in neuroscience the last decade or so. Mm-hmm. And also, I think, integrating sociocultural anthropology, which also has changed in how it approaches, rather than culture doing an imprint on everyone, it's more in everyday activities. And we thought there's a nice match there. Okay.
And I think some of that will get fleshed out as we talk about our possibly differing perspectives on addiction and internet addiction, and so on. Anything else you want to say about neuroanthropology or your blog before we get started?
Yeah, we co-founded it in 1997. Greg Downey, who's at Macquarie University, myself. It's a funny story because we actually were in the same offices in anthropology at Notre Dame. And then he moved to Australia. And at our next annual meetings, we were like, we need to keep talking about these ideas. And so we came up with a blog as a way to share ideas. Mm-hmm. And it was actually better than the talking around the water cooler because we actually had to flesh ideas out and put them down on the internet. And it was neat because people then started to respond to that and it became a much broader conversation.
Mm-hmm. And it is one of the PLOS blogs, P-L-O-S, all capital letters, right? That's like a network of blogs that all seem to be kind of academic or sciencey or something?
Right. So Public Library of Science, or PLOS, is the world's largest publisher of open access papers. And led by PLOS One, and then have highly cited papers also in PLOS Biology, I think more than 10 journals. Okay. And then about 2 years ago, they wanted to establish PLOS blogs as a way to facilitate what they see as one of their major roles, which is to get science out, free to the world. And they thought blogs would be a great way to help do that through science communication. Mm-hmm. And so we had an independent blog, and they invited us as one of the founding blogs, and we were really excited to be part of that.
Okay, sounds good. So our dialogue started off with internet addiction. There was a paper that came out that was by some, I guess, German researchers, and it was billed in the press as them having found, in some cases, and these were the journalists saying this, the scientists didn't quite say it, but having found the internet addiction gene.
Right.
And I noted in my paper, well, for starters, if you look at the actual data, which interestingly, the numbers were not out there. The numbers were not in the press release. The numbers were not in the publicly available abstract. So there was basically, and none of the reporters had seen the numbers clearly. They just had this finding that, they just put it kind of qualitatively that, like, people with this gene are more likely to be addicted to the internet. Well, how much more likely, first of all? And they had their definition of internet addiction. They gave people a survey. How much more likely? And then so I actually paid like $49 to look at the damn paper, and the numbers were just totally underwhelming. I mean, it was just like your chances if you don't have the gene are pretty low, and your chances if you do have the gene are pretty low, but not quite as low, basically. And
as you pointed out, that more people who were classified as internet addicts in this study didn't have the gene.
Right. Yeah. Most the so-called internet, the gene responsible for internet addiction is not present in most people who have internet addiction. So this we agree on. I mean, we agree on the critique of that paper. We'll come to our disagreement. I think you had something you wanted to add by way of critiquing that original paper.
Yeah, completely. I took a much closer look at that paper, and it's not just that they didn't show what the data were actually saying. There was variance there, and genetics are linked to some of it. The sort of classic genetics research that we're doing today. But they really messed up on calling it internet addiction. They used a scale called the, let me just look at it, the Internet Addiction Test, developed by Young in 1998. And this scale goes from about 20 to 100. It's 20 questions, and you do a Likert scale 1 to 5, so the minimum score is 20. Maximum score is 100.
Mm-hmm.
And then they use criteria reported by Young way back in 1998 that if you score less than 40, you're sort of normal.
Mm-hmm.
And way back in 98, not as many people were using the internet. And so I was just sort of going around, and I found the site called Net Addiction, I think it's called, by Kimberly Young. So looking just to see what are the criteria now. And I took her test, okay? And I quite deliberately, tried to get a score about the average score of what these people were reporting in Germany as the ones that were classified as internet addicts. They averaged 47. Okay?
Now, the people that were classified in the study as being internet addicts?
Had a average score of 47.
Average, okay.
Average score of
47 or higher?
No, that was average 47, so whatever the range.
For everyone they called an addict?
Yes, it was 47 score.
What was their cutoff point, do you know?
40 or above
okay.
was going to be.
So it was 40 or above, okay.
Okay, so that's what they reported. And so I took it, and I came in at 49. I didn't necessarily answer all the things truthfully. I just was looking for a similar score. And so, lo and behold, it comes back as saying, you are an average online user. You surf the web a bit too long at times, but you have control over your usage.
Oh, my gosh.
So,
in other words, and
the materials they report, if you want to use this for research, a score of 20 to 49 is, quote, online user with complete control.
Huh.
So
they had the wrong cutoff point.
The addicts weren't addicts.
So the people who did the original survey had kind of recalibrated it or changed the thresholds in accordance with the fact that people in general are using the internet more than they were in 1998.
Right, and we're not quite so worried all the time about it from the science point of view as it might have been in 1998 when it's a new phenomenon we didn't quite know, and often you err on the side of caution on those sorts of things.
And the researchers had not kind of figured that out, apparently.
No.
Now, I guess they would still say, well, it's still the case that the higher the score, blah, 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 right? In other words, the heavier there is a correlation between heaviness of internet use and kind of how much difficulty you have extricating yourself or whatever, they would say, and some gene. I mean, they could, but you're right.
But what they reported was that
right.
the internet addicts, which is literally says that in the paper,
right.
Are using the internet about the same for work, and so the difference really is in time spent online in leisure.
Mm-hmm.
And the control person spends 9.7 hours a week, And the internet addicts spend 16.8 hours per week. So we're talking about 7 hours more per week by these people classified as addicts, an extra hour per day.
Yeah. Although we should add that was not the only criterion. I mean, apparently they asked them questions like, "Do you feel unhappy when you can't get on the internet?" or something kind of.
That's what that scale gets at.
Right.
But they really are looking for scores above 80 now to classify someone as really having problematic use.
So this study is like seriously deficient, I would say. I mean, plus there's the fact that the guy, as I pointed out in my post, the lead scientist said, now we know that internet addiction is real. Like, wait, because you've shown some correlation between genetics and something, that's the definition of an addiction? I mean, seems to me an addiction has to do with, like, your relationship to it, regardless of whether the source is genetic or whatever.
Exactly. I think that's a great way to put it.
I put it that abstractly because I know that if I put it the way I actually put it in my post, then you would critique me as you did. So maybe that's a good place to get into our disagreements. I'll tell you what I said in my post, and then you can tell me where we differ. I mean, broadly speaking, the point of my post was, look, there's one other thing this guy had said. He had said, well, the gene the gene in question is a gene that related to nicotine addiction. It's a gene where I forget how you pronounce the natural neurotransmitter, but the receptor for
acetylcholine.
Exactly. Some genes give you those receptors of a sort that are amenable to nicotine gluing onto them, and I guess that's involved in this was one of those genes, and that's involved. So anyway, this guy said, look, he seemed to be attaching a lot of significance to the fact that it was a gene involved in nicotine addiction. And I said, and part of my point was, look, if you understand what I think chemical addiction is in the first place, it's not. It almost goes without saying that the mechanisms involved in what we call chemical addiction are going to be involved in habit formation generally, and that by itself doesn't tell you whether it's a habit that we should call an addiction. Right? That was my argument.
Yeah, and I think that's a fine argument. It's looking closely at the mechanisms involved. Genetics, the developmental mechanisms, environmental mechanisms, what people are actually doing, the context for use. All those things help shape that relationship, and that's, as you put it, quite nicely before.
Okay, but now we will soon get to the part you disagree with, because I will just quote something from my post that you took issue with. Well, for starters, I said whether heavy internet use deserves to be called an addiction or just a hard-to-break habit is a question about a behavior pattern and its attendant psychological states. To answer it, we ask such things as how strong the cravings for the internet are, what links a person will go to in order to satisfy them, and so on. I think this is where you start to take issue with me, right?
Yeah, I mean, I actually love that you said that it was a hard-to-break habit, right? That habits are important. It's not just about pleasure. You talk about pleasure too. But that I think one of the problems is that we often think of the link between genetics and brain chemistry and psychological states as this very closely tight linked thing, and that the place to look to understand addiction is in those psychological states, whether we characterize them through evolutionary psychology or through drives or other things that you talk about in your post. And I guess I would sort of say two things. One is, as an anthropologist, I would want to recognize a broader context for it, not just the psychology, but also when we use an evolutionary approach, that if it becomes a just so story or not, and that's one problem. Not all the time. I love evolutionary theory. Actually, that's where I got my start. But sometimes just saying it's because people find pleasure, and that's related to fitness benefits, to sort of quote from a famous paper, it doesn't. An end is not a satisfying. It's a nice story, but it's not a satisfying set of scientific conclusions.
Okay, so maybe we should flesh that out. I mean, the specific, what you would call a just so story that I told, and it really is kind of a just so story in the sense that I'm sure there's an array of data that if I looked for it, I could bring to bear on the argument, but it's, I would call kind of commonsensical in my view, and which is that if you ask, how did we get to be these animals that can get addicted to things? I would say, well, we're animals designed by natural selection to form habits. I mean, habits are a natural thing. I mean, natural selection, if you want to, kind of personify it just for the sake of rhetorical convenience, natural selection kind of wanted to get us into certain habits, things that were conducive to spreading our genes. We are designed in quotes, to do a lot, and so whether it's eating meat for nutrition, having sex, or doing things like earning the esteem of your peers, which evolutionary psychologists argue is conducive to fitness itself. Those things, those things that lead to those payoffs, natural selection wanted to give us positive reinforcement for, so that we would do them again, and that is why the dopamine or whatever pleasure-giving chemicals are released upon the attainment of these goals, and so on. So, yeah, it's kind of a just so story, but just to give people a flavor for what it is, I'm saying, and that's why habit formation has this chemical basis, and then sometimes there are chemicals that give us a shortcut to the pleasure, heroin or so on. They intervene in the neurochemical process that was designed to form habits. And they allow us to just kind of sit there and keep doing it. And that's one thing that we call addiction. Just sit there and keep giving ourselves a positive reinforcement. That's one thing we call addiction. So that's the just so story. And so maybe now you can elaborate on your critique of it.
Yeah, and it is a story that's actually out there in the literature, right? So it's a good story. But it's the things I would say about it. I'll start from the evolutionary side. Is you need to think about, first, whether or not addiction is amenable to evolutionary analysis, and if so, how robust will that analysis be, okay? And I, when I started doing evolutionary analysis of addiction, I would have said, of course, yes, it's amenable, and I think it is. It provides insight. But today, as we understand how much development and neuroplasticity environment can come together, you might actually get configurations of things you would never see in evolutionary history. And so that can give a perspective on it, but if it's something sort of qualitatively new, the evolutionary perspective loses some force there.
Well, yeah, although I would emphasize that the point of my story is to explain how something qualitatively new has the effect it has. In other words, a syringe with heroin is absolutely not part of the environment we were designed for, because if it were, we would avoid it rather than because it's not conducive to fitness to be addicted to heroin. What it does, but you can see how it is a kind of a chemical intervention. I mean, in my view, understanding the brain that evolved does shed light on why a chemical like heroin or caffeine or anything is habit forming. How we came to have brains that can, form habits around the administering of chemicals. I do think the evolutionary story, pretty plausibly explains that.
So it really comes down to how you go about that, right? And so one thing I would say, or I have said, is you need a more sophisticated story about how these things evolve. And so if you think about, if addiction is something new, it has to build on previous adaptive problems, if you want to sort of use an evolutionary psychology approach. And one thing that would happen in the past is we'd have to find and then consume food and find and mate with partners, right? And so you have this structure and adaptive problem where you have to seek things out and you sort of have to engage and consume them. And a lot of the emphasis on telling the just so story about addiction is focused on the consumption part, right? That the reward, something's gone wrong with the fitness benefits there.
Wait, can you?
So a lot of the evolutionary story is like something's chemicals give these sort of false fitness benefits, to use a direct quote from a paper I know of. Drugs give this pleasure, and we equate that with fitness, and that's why we get off track.
I wouldn't have put it that way, but because I don't think we think consciously about fitness. I mean, it's not like the drugs fool us into thinking we're doing something that's good for our genes and that's why people take heroin, right? I mean, so if that's what you mean, that's not the way I would have put it. But anyway, kind of.
But let me focus on the second part well, actually the first part in one sense. So if you separate this problem, there's two adopted problems to solve: seeking out things and engaging with them. And there's a long line of research from Robinson and Kent Berridge and Terry Robinson, I think so, Terry, that focuses on addiction as actually involving more the seeking side of things, what they call incentive salience. And this is actually much closer to habit. It's not necessarily about pleasure. And they have quite clear demonstration with animal models that it's this system, one of the systems mediated by mesolimbic dopamine system, it really is involved in this function of mediating salience, or how involved, how much effort you put into something, how much you seek it out. And that, in addiction research, would really match up with the craving that people experience and this obsessive involvement they often find. Like, to use the internet example, you always have to check it, right? It might not be rewarding. You got to check it. You got to sort of shift and just check to make sure it's there. And so
you mean like checking your Twitter feed or something? Like
yeah. So
that's a problem. That's a problem for me.
Yeah, like, or to give you an example for me, I don't know how. Yeah, there's pleasurable things on the internet, but that's not sort of what gets me. It's like that I have to check my email every single time I sit down at the computer. I have to check it, right? And that habit. It's nothing I'm like excited about my email. I'm not excited about my email, but I still have to check my email.
Well, that maybe is more of a duty. There are things we do that we, as out of a sense of duty, but aren't there some things on the internet you do habitually because they often enough give you pleasure? I think that's what Twitter is like for me. Also, it's like a relative thing. It's like I'm supposed to be doing work. Well, Twitter at its worst is more fun than work, right? So it's a relatively pleasurable thing. But I mean, I really feel the pull, like, viscerally. If you pay attention, right, and, like, it's that moment where you look over and the number in my tab, at least on Twitter, it says, 14. There's 14 new tweets you haven't read.
Yeah.
The thing, it's like, it's something in here, in my gut that's, like, pulling me over. I want it the way I want food.
Exactly. And what I've researched and what Robinson Baird would say is it's actually a problem of that visceral sense of involvement, that pull, that wanting it, rather than pleasure per se. I think pleasure's there. They de-emphasize pleasure a little bit too much, and we can talk about that in a second. But to emphasize the involvement, wanting side, as an anthropologist, I did a lot of my work down in Colombia in South America, and when I first came across this theory from Robinson Baird, it was only done with rats. And I was like, well, let's check this out with people. So I was one of the first people to try to see if you could construct a scale that would measure this incentive salience. And it turned out that was it. And the reason I fixated on wanting with you was because I had worked as a drug counselor in Colombia before going on to my graduate school in anthropology. And the way they talked about addiction wasn't about pleasure. The way they characterized addiction was actually querer más y más, to want more and more.
Right.
And that really, from the ethnographic work, I was sort of primed, in a sense, to look at the neurobiological data in a different way, or theories in a different way. And I came across this theory of incentive salience from Robinson Baird and said, that makes sense, that addiction is as much about wanting and not being able to regulate that wanting as it is about pleasure, and that the brain, in a sense, dissociates these mechanisms, one to mediate reward and a sense of feedback, and one to mediate what you get involved with, sort of where you're going versus evaluating if it's something good or pleasurable for you.
Okay, but they are complementary, aren't they? And I mean, they're both there. I mean, when the drug addict finally gets the drug, there is the feeling of pleasure. And don't you think that is the thing that, the repetition of that is what gives rise to the yearning?
No.
You don't.
This is where
so you're telling me
complicated. No, but this is where it gets complicated in the sense that I can say yes. Robinson and Baird really emphasized wanting, and I wasn't really expecting to. I was expecting to say, oh yeah, addiction is just about this wanting, and then I want to actually talk with people who use drugs really heavily. There was a lot of pleasure there in the moment too, right? So pleasure does play a role. I'm not going to say that. But it's not always about pleasure, actually, for drug users. So to give you a sense, sometimes it's about, for example, an alcoholic or heroin user, about taking away negative feelings. It's not quite pleasure, but it's changing things.
Well, but I would say reducing, getting rid of negative feelings or even partly neutralizing them is a pleasurable experience. I mean, I would say that's positive reinforcement.
So let me give you another example. Is one of the girls I spoke with extensively about her drug use, the way she sort of characterized why she used marijuana was it gave me these very present sensations, right? The drug effects. And that put me in a video. And that video took me away from my home life, which in her case was quite painful. And so what was interesting about that, it wasn't just about the pleasurable sensations or being taken away, but the fact that through the drug she imagined herself or felt herself in a different subjective space. And so I'd be very hesitant about reducing it all to just positive reinforcement, just because the brain is mediating lots of things. And I think that sense of, oh, I have to check on my Twitter account because there's so many, it's not so much about the positive reinforcement, it's about checking what's going on and why we find that meaningful.
Yeah, although I do think, I mean, if day after day my inbox is filled with just bad news, I really do think any urge to check my inbox would be reduced over time.
And normally that's what would happen. But yeah, what does get decoupled is that sense of being able to evaluate that. And once these triggers come, you just sort of get into that space. So one way to think about this from a brain point of view, and which I talk about in my chapter in the Occulture Brain, is that as you become addicted to something or form habits, really this is based on research in animal models on habit formation, you shift the activation of the brain from the ventral striatum, which is more about reward, to the dorsal striatum, which is about habits and associative learning. And as you do that, you suddenly respond much more just through the chunking of what you're supposed to do now. And you're no longer really caring as much, or it's harder to evaluate whether this is good or bad. And so one thing that is both clear from ethnographic work but also from clinical work is this is something that people who have serious substance abuse problems struggle with, is that once they're in that moment, they're sort of just going through the motions and they have a very hard sense to sort of get out of that. And one way to explain that is through this shift in brain mechanics, but also that as they're doing that, they're putting themselves into different environments, which also, not just internally, but externally reinforce what they're doing. So not all internal reinforcement, but also external stuff. And I think that's one area where we disagree, that evolutionary psychology approach will often come back to drives or some pleasure or something, and I would want to expand out to recognize that context can also drive behavior.
Yeah, I wouldn't deny that, and maybe we can broaden the conversation to kind of evolutionary psychology more broadly. There's this one thing you said that I would take issue with. Let's see. You said, okay, you were characterizing my view, and kind of psychology broadly, maybe, because you said...
I think so. I wasn't
so here's, a kind of a psychologocentric view, maybe, you were, but you say, so here's the psychology trump card. Take a human behavior, say internet use. The way to explain that becomes a question about, quote, psychological states. I think those are sarcastic quotation marks. And cravings and, quote, what links a person will go to. And yes, that's the way we often think in the United States, and possibly in other nations. Anyway, it's the meme to break all memes. Our minds explain who we are and exist independently of environment, culture, and all the rest. And I would say, I certainly don't think evolutionary psychology is positing a mind that is independent of environment and culture, either in the sense of psychological development, right? In other words, evolutionary psychology can account for early environment and culture steering your character, your personality, your behavioral inclinations in one direction or another, or in the sense of the moment. You're always reacting to an environment, and typically culture is in some sense part of that environment. So I don't think it's fair to characterize the view of psychology I adhere to as literally saying we exist independently of environment and culture. And I think you'd be hard pressed to find an evolutionary psychologist who would say that. Although you can certainly find some simplistic ideas in all fields, some simplistic thinkers in all fields.
So what I would say in response is what I was objecting to when I wrote that is the sense that everything has to be mediated through psychology, in the sense that this is a very typical way that people in the United States and elsewhere, as you say, talk about and try to understand and interpret our behavior, that there must be some psychological state that is important, that's determinative. To give you a fun example from Colombia, I remember a friend of mine was working with a Colombian writer on a screenplay. And I went out with the Colombian who was working with my friend on the screenplay, was American. And they're talking about doing this play, not a play, I think it is going to be a TV script. But the example was that they wanted to describe this story about a boy relating to a mango tree. Okay? And so this Colombian was complaining about my friend's thing that to understand the relationship between the boy and the mango tree, there had to be something past, there had to be something inside the boy that would explain that. And he was saying, I just don't get that. For me, if you just describe the relationship and how it's happening and the moment, then that was enough. You don't have to posit that there was something that happened when the boy was young that made him more predisposed to do that. And I remember that story because it reminds me to check my own instincts as an American to say, okay, yes, it has to be about the wanting, or it has to be about the subjective experience, rather than, say, a role to play that they've learned, and that when you put in that social setting, you'll do that role. And I think the neuroscience actually supports that in the sense that we look at dopamine signaling among monkeys. They did really innovative experiments where they manipulated status of the monkeys, and that you can do that by how you introduce the order of monkeys into a particular cage. The ones that come first tend to be the dominant ones. The ones that come second tend to be the lower ranked ones. That stresses the lower status ones out, irrespective of where they were before. And just being in that lower status, made them more vulnerable to abusing cocaine. And so this is not necessarily that there's no brain mechanisms or even psychology involved.
Well, in fact,
that status role drives it.
Sure, but I think we know of some correlations between biochemistry and status. Not that are determinative of status necessarily, but haven't they shown that if you reshuffle the status hierarchy in some non-human primates, then the relative levels of like serotonin or something will change?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so it's this sense, I think, today that as we recognize how much our social environment can drive things or change things, that theorizing from genes to modules in the brain to reacting to the environment isn't always the way to solve a problem. I think that's one way to solve a problem, but I prefer actually combining both ways, that we'll go genes, thinking about what's happening in the brain, reaction to the environment, but also environment, how that shapes neuroplasticity or development, and how that also can shape how people react, not necessarily because it came from evolution or gifted by genetics.
Well, yeah, but what I think we would say is, if you ask, okay, so you're happy with an account that emphasizes that it's that when there's a change in the status hierarchy, this is like a change in the primate's environment in a certain sense, social environment. Now they're on top and you're on the bottom, or vice versa. That is what leads ultimately to a change in behavioral proclivity at the other end, right? With attraction to cocaine or whatever it is. So that's an account that's emphasizing that the environment experience is really important. But what the evolutionary psychologist would say is, well, right, but the environment had this, first of all, had this effect by altering something about brain chemistry, B, and A, and B, the mechanism that's at work there, the mechanism, the algorithm, you might say, that says, okay, given this environmental input, I'm going to change the brain chemistry this way, and that will lead to this behavioral input. That is itself a product of evolution. And in fact, this very thing, I wrote my book on evolutionary psychology, The Moral Animal, in 1994. That was a long time ago, okay?
A great book.
Oh, well, that's very nice of you to say. I wasn't sure that would be your opinion. But I described this very thing by way of emphasizing that we're not saying that everything's in the genes, so your place in the social hierarchy is in your genes. It can be the opposite. The genes can, and the mental mechanisms they build and mediate can explain why environment is so powerful.
But I don't know if all evolutionary psychologists approach problem solving that way. And for me, actually, what it is not necessarily about that, evolutionary theorizing is bad. I do a lot of evolutionary theorizing. It's about, in one sense, being able to have multiple hypotheses to test. So to give you an example from my work in Columbia, I actually wanted to build really interesting evolutionary hypotheses into my work. And so one of the major, I was working with adolescents, and a lot of the things that are coming up public health at that point was, oh my gosh, adolescents are killing their brains and doing all this bad stuff. Why in the world would they be using drugs? And the evolutionary point of view was, well, there must be some benefits to it. It doesn't necessarily have to be evolved. There can be adaptive benefits. And one thing that was clear from having worked with them was that they often were able to be involved in more sexual relationships, positive sexual relationships, not negative ones, to be clear about that. And oftentimes they saw that by using drugs, they could be better at competing or doing things like that. And so my data, when I asked, how many times have you actually gone through this, there was a clear difference between people who had much more substance use versus those who hadn't, that they had experienced those sorts of things, right? Mm-hmm. And that's good, but then when I tried to put that in with other things, like what's actually happening with salience in the brain and that actual mechanism which could go wrong, the evolutionary stuff fell out, and it wasn't as strong a predictor. So I think it's important, but to not always expect that evolution will be the final card, right? Or that it's shot all the way through. And yeah, I think, playing around with these ideas and saying, well, public health, we actually don't get why people do some things because there are perfectly sensible evolutionary reasons to do it. But when you actually try to get down to explain something like addiction, I actually more in the sense do take the epidemiological or public health view, where I want to measure all the factors and in a sense see what sticks. The evolutionary stuff, whether it's from life history theory or from, say, a behavioral ecology approach, didn't stick as well. And what did stick was looking at the brain mechanisms, which have an evolutionary basis, right? But they didn't actually need Robinson and Berridge, the evolutionary background, to come up with that hypothesis.
Yeah. I think you often don't need it. And I think, in principle, someone who knew nothing about, a team of 1 million scientists who are trying to figure out the human brain and everything about us and the role of culture and environment, and knew nothing about natural selection, could eventually get the picture. They could in principle figure out the brain without knowing about natural selection.
1 million scientists.
A million, not one less. But what I'm saying, but my point is, what I would say is, sometimes thinking about evolutionary history and just throwing around conjectures even can lead you more rapidly to a hypothesis about the way the brain works that will bear fruit.
Yeah, and I think so. And I have no problem with that. I think it's this characterization that the only way to do those sort of evolutionary hypotheses, not the only way, but the style of thinking that it somehow has to only be about a psychological state. Mm-hmm. That's where things fall apart. So if we think about addiction, well, it's either a moral failing or it's a brain disease, sort of is the way it goes. And if it's a moral failing, it's about, if they lost control. If it's a brain disease, they have too much craving and they've lost executive control. And taking that sort of innatist view that there must be some essential thing that's different about what's happening in the minds of addicts is a narrowing view. And that can be successful at times, but I think it actually misses when you start looking at, in a predictive fashion, what's involved in it. You're missing the bigger picture. Okay.
Can I ask you a question that's related? And I don't know if you know the answer, but you're more likely to than I am because you clearly know more about the biochemistry of addiction. One thing I've just kind of wondered is, in all the pop accounts, you read about the moment of reward. I mean, if I had $1 for every time the word dopamine appears, in just kind of the popular media in a given day, I mean, it's really become, it's like they're treating, every form of pleasure has now become this news story where they report that dopamine is involved, right? But
as bad as internet addiction genes,
right? But what I haven't seen much on. Okay, so I'll accept that that moment when I'm feeling the pleasure, some reward chemical, often dopamine, is maybe being released. But that other phase that we talked about, the yearning phase,
right?
I don't hear so much about the biochemistry of that, and I'm just curious. Do they know? I mean, what's going on in my brain when I'm wanting it?
Part of what I'm doing today is always saying it's complicated, which always frustrates me. But addiction's a very complicated thing, and the story 10 years ago would have been that two groups were arguing about dopamine. Was it more about the yearning? Did it drive the yearning, or did it drive the pleasure? And one of the latest papers I read from Ronson Barrage is that it's actually even weirder than that. That, in a sense, this idea of incentive salience, that yearning, isn't localized in the mesolimbic dopamine system. As long as you get the right kind of functional set happening in the brain, it's in a sense the psychology is linked to but not determined by the biological mechanisms. So you can have it happening at different points. That actually might be something that would lead to more evolutionary psychological theorizing. But what we do know is in terms of actual pleasure, it's not really about dopamine. Dopamine does lots of things. Dopamine is actually linked to pain. Dopamine is linked to changing your attention. For me, that's the big thing about dopamine is actually it's more about like, I got to check my Twitter, or I got to, do any sorts of number of things like that. And or how much effort you put into things is another thing that dopamine seems to mediate. And also to mediate one idea about brain function, which seems to be gaining a lot of prominence, which is that it's an error signal, that the differences between previous patterns of responding to dopamine and the actual responses, that difference can be a teaching signal. So say, you came and got a great reward, and then you kind of get used to it, right? And then when it doesn't happen, though you're expecting it, your dopamine spikes again. And that's sort of a teaching signal to get you to pay attention to your environment. So those actually seem to be
it spikes in the absence of the reinforcement?
Yes. To say, pay attention to this because something went wrong, right? But in terms of the pleasurable stuff, it's much more to do with opiates. I mean, heroin's a very pleasurable thing. And there's all sorts of opioid receptors throughout your brain and in different spots. And so, one of the things that really changed my view about how to think about pleasure, two things. One was to hear that there are these pleasure receptors in the part of your brain that processes sound. It's like, well, sound and music is not right there in the center of your brain, but also you can sense visceral pleasure. But humans are really strange too, because I was finishing this run one time, and I was in extreme pain, right? Finishing around hard as I could. As soon as I stopped, I was like, that was a great run. And I was like, that, like I was kind of felt euphoric about it. And that's just animals don't generally do that, right? But I had
it was just the cessation of pain that was pleasurable.
Right, there's that shift, right? And I knew I had done what I set out to do, and that in itself was pleasurable, despite a lot of physical pain at the end. And humans really seem to be able to do that sort of shifting of what sensations actually mean, right? What pleasure and pain actually means. And that, in my case, in the run, came because I was training to try to run a fast 5K, and I knew that would be the kind of work I needed to put in to be able to do a fast race.
Right. I mean, if you compare two marathon runners, and one of them finishes just ahead of the other, so one has won and one has lost,
yeah.
I'm sure they're feeling very differently, and very differently about the sheer fatigue and pain that they've just inflicted on themselves.
And so as a neuroanthropologist, I want to be able to also recognize those kind of dynamics as really part of why people do what they do, including become addicted to things.
So it sounds like, I mean, the dopamine story is not nearly as clearly worked out as popular accounts would have it.
No, not at all. Not at all.
Is it not even totally clear that it is this very common source of pleasure as the popular accounts would have it? I mean, it sounds like you're saying, well, go ahead.
I'm sure you'll find someone out there who'll say, yes, it's clearly linked to pleasure. It is linked to pleasure, right? But it sort of depends on the timing and what else is happening in the brain at the same time, is if we would then experience that as pleasure, right? If we all have that subjective sense of pleasure. What it is clear is that it is linked to all sorts of things that have to do with decision-making processes, right? And how much to do when, and when to pay attention when things aren't ending up the way they should.
And it does seem also to be involved in the kind of yearning phase, but presumably in a somewhat different way.
Yeah, to your response to incentives, right? Oh my gosh, all those tweets are mounting up. And you get the sense that you have to respond.
Right. So at that moment when I see I've got 20 tweets and it's like pulling me over there. It's like I want to go. The conventional wisdom is that at that point dopamine is already having some effect.
Yeah. I mean, but
I haven't felt the reward yet.
We're finding that they do multiple roles,
right.
Which I think is really fascinating. So just like the pop science story about internet addiction genes, when you actually dig into the data, it looks very different.
Right.
Same thing. Once you get over the hump of equating dopamine as a pleasure drug, the data are really cool. There's lots of really cool things happening with dopamine, and I actually think that gets us closer to things that we actually relate more to what addictive behavior is about.
Right. Okay. That is interesting. Okay. Well, listen. Thank you. We've been at this, I think, almost an hour, so we should probably wrap it up. I'll give you a chance to say anything else I
just want to say thank you, Bob. It's been a pleasure to talk with you. I was definitely surprised when you came back and said, let's debate about this. Not every journalist would do that, and I really respect that.
Not every journalist has a video website.
So, and I love this idea of having science in the open. That's one of the things that PLOS is about, and to actually have more communication between researchers working on these problems and scientists and the public. I think this is really important as part of what science does and what academia can do.
Yeah. Well, this has been fun. Maybe we'll have a chance to do it again.
All right, and I can tell you more about what I mean by the uncultured brain.
Yeah, do, and we will link to that, and we'll link to anything else you want us to link to, certainly including your blog.
All right.
Okay.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.